Let me first start by introducing myself. My name is Abhay Anturkar. I'm an advocate practicing now in the Supreme Court. Um, I started my practice with Mr. Ashutosh Kumbhakoni, who is now the Advocate General of Maharashtra. I practiced with him for 2 years, and then I moved out of Bombay, went off to London to do my LLM in intellectual property. I came back from London and I worked with my father, Mr. Anil Anturkar, who is a senior advocate in the Bombay High Court. And thereafter, when my senior, Mr. Srihari Ane, who also is my professional mentor, became the Advocate General, he very kindly asked me to join him and assist him in his role as the Advocate General. As we all know, he's had a very brief time as the Advocate General. On him resigning from the post, I shifted my base to Delhi and I joined the chambers of Mr. Gaurav Agarwal, who is a very respected advocate on the record in the Supreme Court of India. Many of you may have heard about him from in numerous cases where he's been appointed as an amicus. Um, for the past 2 years, I have been practicing in the Supreme Court of India independently. I am getting comments now that the audio and the video is fine. So I think I'm going to begin my lecture now. Firstly, before that, I hope and pray that all of you are safe at home, especially all my colleagues in Pune and Mumbai. I'm sitting here in Delhi, but my thoughts are always with all my friends, my family who are stuck in Pune and Mumbai. I hope the situation improves soon. Let me thank the Adhivakta Parishad for conducting these lectures on a regular basis. These lectures not only enable us to keep ourselves occupied, but also give us food for thought and help us enhance our legal knowledge um, and our personalities. I have been keenly watching these lectures. I particularly enjoyed the lecture delivered by Dr. Kedare because she addressed an extremely important point. Also, the lecture delivered by our esteemed senior, Mr. Ram Apte, was wonderful. It's a tall order to follow all these lectures for a relatively junior advocate like myself. I will, however, make every endeavor to live up to the standards set by the previous speakers and live up to the confidence shown in me by the Adhivakta Parishad. The topic which I will speak on is extremely vast, as the jurisprudence relating to it spans over more than 2 centuries and across 2 continents. By way of this lecture, I attempt to give an overview of the topic and assist all of you in venturing out on your own to conduct legal research on it. The topic, as you know, is force majeure and the pandemic. I have divided this talk in a few segments. I will firstly be talking about the origin of force majeure in the common law system. I will thereafter be talking about the statutory basis for the concept of force majeure and the doctrine of frustration in the Indian context. I will thereafter talk about the origin and the recognition of the concept and the enunciation on it by the Indian courts, and thereafter would address the contemporary position, which is the early 2000s and the 2010s, when contemporary courts have discussed this topic. And lastly, I would address this topic in the context of the current situation that we're facing. Talking about the origin of force majeure in the common law system, we must remember that the contractual law in England was extremely rigid. A contract had to be performed, notwithstanding the fact that it had become performing it, owing to some unforeseen event after it was made, which was not the fault of either of the parties to the contract. This position was addressed and recalibrated by Justice Blackburn in 1863 in his judgment of Taylor versus Caldwell. The facts of this case are very interesting. Caldwell had agreed to let the Surrey Gardens and Music Hall to Taylor on 5 days. This was let for the purpose of giving a series of 4 grand concerts on the days at the rent of about 1,001 sterling pounds for each of those days. After making of the agreement and before the first day on which the concert was to be given, the hall was destroyed by fire. Since the contract could not be performed by Caldwell, Taylor brought a suit against him before the Queen's Bench. The question which fell for the court's consideration was whether, under the circumstances that I have mentioned, the loss which was sustained by Taylor, was attributable to Caldwell, who was the defendant. There was no express stipulation about a disaster in the contract, no force majeure clause as we do have in modern day contracts. So the court was required to address the question upon the general rule of law applicable to the contract. Now keep in mind, as I said in the beginning, at this point, the law relating to contracts in England is extremely stringent. If you have entered into a contract, then you have to perform it. At this point, Justice Blackburn observes, and I'm quoting him because I think it's a very interesting observation, the principle seems to be that in contracts in which the performance depends on the continued existence of a given person or a thing, a condition is implied that the impossibility of performance arising from the perishing of that person or thing shall excuse the performance. In none of these cases is the promise in words other than positive, nor is there any express stipulation that the destruction of the person or thing shall excuse the performance. But the excuse is by law implied, because from the nature of the contract, it is apparent that the parties contracted on the basis of the continued existence of the particular person or the chattel. In the present case, looking at the whole contract, we find that the parties contracted on the basis of the continued existence of the music hall at the time when the concerts were to be given, that being essential to their performance. Justice Blackburn held that if some unforeseen event occurs during the performance of a contract, which makes it impossible to perform that, in the sense that the fundamental basis of the contract goes, it needs to not be performed. This is a very important aspect of the matter. The fundamental basis is a concept that you may keep at the back of your mind, because this is something that we will be addressing shortly. This perhaps was one of the first instances of a party being excused from performing contract due to an act beyond its comprehension and control, resulting in the performance itself being rendered impossible. In Robinson versus Davidson, which is 1871 6 EX 269, there was a contract between a plaintiff and a defendant that the defendant would play the piano at a concert to be given by the plaintiff on a specified day. On that day, the defendant was unable to perform because of illness. The contract did not contain any term as to what was to be done in case of the defendant being too ill to perform. The plaintiff brought an action against the defendant for breach of contract. Again, at this point, other than the judgment that I referred to earlier, delivered by Justice Blackburn, the law still continues to be that if you have entered into a contract, you perform it. If you don't perform it, you pay damages. So a suit was brought by the plaintiff against the defendant, alleging that the defendant had not performed her part of the contract and therefore seeking damages. In this context, the court observed that it was not the obligation engrafting a new term upon the express contract. It was not the obligation upon the defendant to perform, even in a situation where she was unable to perform because of factors beyond her control. The obligation was absolute in the original agreement, subject only to the new condition which was added to it. The whole question was whether the original contract was absolute or conditional, and having regard to the terms of the contract, the court held that this kind of a contract is really conditional, albeit that it looks absolute from the bare terms of it. A very interesting decision came up after that, which was in 1916 2 AC 397. This is the case of Tamplin Steamship versus Anglo-Mexican Petroleum Products. We are still discussing the origin of the doctrine of force majeure in common law in England. We haven't reached India as yet. Lord Loeburn in Tamplin Steamship observed that if substantially the whole contract becomes impossible of performance, or in other words, impracticable, by some cause for which neither of the parties was responsible, then the party may be excused. Again, please note that the term used is substantially the whole contract becomes impossible of performance. The English law has passed through various stages of development, and the principles enunciated in the different judgments, however, cannot be said to be uniform. You have the English courts blowing hot and cold at the same time. In any case, as in 2020, Indian law is very well developed, and the Supreme Court, in a couple of decisions, has held that even on the concept of force majeure, um, what has to be followed is the Indian law as enunciated in the Contract Act and as explained by the Supreme Court while dealing with the Contract Act. Now, what is force majeure really in the Indian context, or what is the scope of force majeure in the Indian context? The leading judgment about the scope and ambit of the term of force majeure is that of Dhanrajmal Gobindram versus Shamji Kalidas. Dhanrajmal Gobindas versus Shamji Kalidas is AIR 1961, Supreme Court 1285. This was one of the earliest cases where the concept of force majeure was discussed by the Supreme Court of India. I'm just going to go through the facts to help us understand the observations made by the Supreme Court. Dhanrajmal, who are the buyers, had entered into an agreement with Shamji Kalidas, who were the sellers. They were to purchase 500 bales of African cotton. The contract was in the form of letters. The terms of the contract included the provision for the seller to carry forward the contract in case of any failure on the part of the buyer, and also a right to resell the goods after giving notice to the buyer. In other words, the buyer was to abide by certain terms of the contract, failing which the seller was entitled either to carry forward the contract and carry forward the goods, or to resell the goods and sort of get the balance of payment from the seller. I'm sorry. One of the term in the contract which led to the controversy was, and I'm quoting here the term of the contract: we confirm having sold to you African raw cotton on the following terms and conditions. Please mark the next part: subject to the usual force majeure clause. Please note that there was no specific force majeure clause identified in the agreement itself. It only said that the sale is taking place subject to the terms and conditions which are specified in the contract and subject to the usual force majeure clause. The dispute arose because the contract was not performed. The sellers raised a dispute. The sellers wrote numerous letters. The buyers responded and disputed the letters. In the meanwhile, the sellers carried forward the contract and invoked their right to resale after giving notice. Now, there was an arbitration clause in the agreement, and because there was an arbitration clause in the agreement, the sellers approached the Honorable Bombay High Court under Section 20 of the Arbitration Act of 1940, seeking an appointment of the arbitrator. The buyers rejected the contentions of the sellers by contending that they were not obliged to perform the agreement because the agreement was void and illegal on the ground of vagueness and uncertainty, thereby there being no agreement between the parties. The High Court dismissed this petition initially on certain technical grounds. The matter went up in an inter-court appeal before the division bench. The division bench observed that there was a dispute in relation to the contract and therefore remanded the matter back to the learned single judge. After the remand, the matter was again heard by the same single judge, and the learned single judge dismissed it again on the ground that Section 20 provided that the court had to appoint an arbitrator if the parties failed to agree. Now, a very technical view was taken by the judge. He said that you have not pleaded in your petition that the parties had failed to agree, and therefore I can't come to the conclusion that the parties had failed to agree, which was an ingredient of Section 20. However, he did observe that the contract was not void for vagueness or uncertainty on account of the reference to the usual force majeure clause. So therefore, the contention of the defendants was categorically rejected. The sellers appealed against the dismissal and the buyers appealed against the adverse findings. So there was a cross objection raised by the buyers. The appeal was allowed and the cross objection was rejected by the division bench. This is how the matter came up before a 3-judges bench of the Supreme Court, which consisted of Justice J.L. Kapoor, Justice Hidayatullah, and Justice J.C. Shah. Justice Hidayatullah has authored the judgment, and while considering the contention about the vagueness of the contract because of the use of the term usual force majeure clause, Justice Hidayatullah observed, and I'm quoting him now because it's relevant here, amongst other contentions, the buyers contended that the agreement was void because of vagueness and uncertainty arising from the use of the phrase usual force majeure. The argument was that there was no consensus additive and that the parties had not specified which force majeure clause they had in mind. Force majeure clauses can be of different kinds. The sellers, on the other hand, have contended that the addition of the word usual shows that there was some clause which was to be included in such agreement. In these circumstances, we are called upon to consider what is the scope of the phrase force majeure. So here the Supreme Court is now considering what is the scope of the term force majeure. They say in Lebopin versus Crispin, McCarty J has given an account of what is meant by force majeure. With reference to its history, the expression force majeure is not a mere French version of the Latin expression vis major. So here, let me pause for a moment and observe that the Supreme Court has actually said that force majeure as a concept is far wider than the concept of vis major, which is a Latin concept. And I'm quoting again from the Supreme Court judgment. It is undoubtedly a term of wider import. Difficulties have arisen in the past as to what could legitimately be included in force majeure. The judges have agreed that strikes, breakdown of machinery, which though normally not included in vis major, are included in force majeure. An analysis of the rulings on the subject shows that where a reference is made to force majeure, the intention is to save the performing party from the consequences of anything over which he has no control. Again, let me just repeat this because this is relevant. The analysis of the rulings on the subject shows that where reference is made to force majeure, the intention is to save the performing party from the consequences of anything over which he has no control. So look at how wide the scope of the term is in the view of the Supreme Court of India. Now, just to conclude this judgment, the Supreme Court ultimately held that the contract was not void for vagueness or uncertainty because of the reference in terms stated to the force majeure clause. On the other grounds as well, the buyers failed to convince the Supreme Court and the appeal was dismissed. The judgment is now helping us understand the scope and ambit of this term force majeure and it being far wider than mere act of God. And I say mere act of God because act of God would be narrower than force majeure. There may be certain items which are not included in act of God, but which will probably be included in the term force majeure. In my assessment, whether the performance of a contract is excused on the ground of force majeure or what we in India call the doctrine of frustration will depend on facts and circumstances of every case. There cannot be a straitjacket formula which can be laid down to be applicable to each and every case. Let us now look at force majeure and the doctrine of frustration in the statutory context. We all know that agreements in India are governed by the Contract Act. If it is relatable to an express or an implied clause in a contract, it will be governed by Chapter 3. More particularly, first we will look at Section 32, which deals with contingent contracts. And if there is no term relating to force majeure in a contract, then in my assessment, it will be dealt with the rule of positive law under Section 56 of the Contract Act. So two relevant sections that we may have to keep in mind. One is Section 32, where there is a FMC or a force majeure clause in a contract, and the other is Section 56, where there is no such clause in a contract. Now, according to the Indian Contract Act, a promise may be express or implied. In cases, therefore, where the court gathers as a matter of construction of the contract itself containing an implied or an express term, according to which a party may stand discharged on the happening of a certain circumstance, the dissolution would take place under the terms of the contract itself. Such cases would be outside the purview of Section 56 and within the purview of Section 32. Let us look at Section 56 for a moment. Section 56 speaks of an agreement to do an impossible act. Amongst other things, it says that an agreement to do an act impossible in itself is void, and it also says that a contract to do an act which, after the contract is made, becomes impossible or by reason of some event which the promiser could not prevent, becomes unlawful, becomes void when the act becomes impossible or unlawful. Let me just repeat that. A contract to do an act which, after the contract is made, becomes impossible or by reason of some event which the promiser could not prevent, unlawful, it becomes void when the act becomes impossible or unlawful. This contains the doctrine of frustration as developed by the English jurisprudence and is absorbed in India by virtue of Section 56 of the Contract Act. Let us now look at how this Section 56 has been dealt with by the Indian courts. I am not going to talk too much about Section 32 because, to put it simply, Section 32 says that if there is a clause in the agreement about when certain liabilities arise or extinguish, then it will be governed by that clause itself, not so much. So it is fairly straightforward. So let us not discuss that more in detail in this lecture, perhaps some other time. Let us go back to Section 56 and look at how that has been dealt with by the Indian courts. Again, I'm not going to discuss a large number of judgments because we don't have that much time. So let me just discuss a few important ones. The first interesting judgment that I came across is a judgment of Satyabrata Ghosh versus Mugniram Bangar and Company. This, in my assessment, is a leading judgment on Section 56 of the Contract Act. Let me just discuss the facts very briefly. Mugniram was the owner of a large tract of land situated in Calcutta. The company had started, Mugniram is the name of the company, which had started a scheme for development of this land for residential purposes. The area was divided into a large number of plots. The company entered into agreements with different purchasers to sell the plots and accepted from them an earnest amount. They undertook to construct the roads and drains necessary for making the lands suitable for building and residential purposes. As soon as the amenities were completed, the purchaser was called upon to complete the conveyance by paying the balance consideration. One such purchaser was Satyabrata Ghosh. In fact, Satyabrata Ghosh was a nominee of one such purchaser, but for all intents and purposes, he is the purchaser. Now, what happens here is that in 1941, when the Second World War is going on, the collector of the district where the land was situated passes an order under the Defence of India rules, pursuant to which a portion of the land covered by the scheme is requisitioned for military purposes. Thereafter, another order is passed requisitioning another portion of the same land, and a similar third order is passed. The company then informs Satyabrata Ghosh that since the substantial portion of the land has been taken over by the government, and because there is no way of knowing how long the government would retain the possession of this land, the construction of amenities cannot be taken up at this stage. In these circumstances, they offered two options. One was to take back the earnest money and cancel the agreement, or the second was to take the land as it is on an as is and where is basis, without the company abiding by its commitment to construct the amenities. In these circumstances, Satyabrata Ghosh files a suit against the company seeking twofold declarations. One, he says that one declaration that he seeks is that the contract between the company and the purchaser be declared to be subsisting, and two, that the plaintiff is entitled to get the conveyance executed and registered on payment of the consideration in the manner and under the conditions specified therein. This suit was resisted on numerous grounds. One of the grounds that the company raised was that the contract was discharged by frustration, as it became impossible by reason of supervening events to perform a material part of it. The trial court, however, rejected this contention and decreed the plaintiff's suit. The first appeal was rejected by the district court, and that is how the second appeal comes up before the Calcutta High Court. The only question canvassed before the High Court was, in the second appeal, was whether the contract of sale was frustrated. The High Court answered the question in the affirmative in favor of the defendant company, and on that ground alone dismissed the plaintiff's suit. This is how the matter comes up before the Supreme Court pursuant to a certificate granted by the High Court under Article 133 1C of the Constitution, and it is heard by a three judges bench consisting of Justice B.K. Mukherjee, Justice Bose, and Justice N.H. Bhagwati. The judgment was delivered by Justice B.K. Mukherjee. And while he discusses Section 56 of the Contract Act, he observes, and I quote, and I'm referring to paragraph 9 of the AIR report. He says, the AIR, in paragraph 9 of the AIR report, this much is clear that the word impossible, as used in Section 56, has not been used in the sense of physical or literal impossibility. The performance of an act may not be literally impossible, but it may be impracticable and useless from the point of view of the object and purpose for which the parties had come together. And if an untoward event or change of the circumstances totally upsets the very foundation upon which the parties rested their bargain, it can very well be said the promiser finds it impossible to do the act which he promised to do. In the next para 10, Justice Mukherjee says, although various theories have been propounded by the judges and jurists in England regarding the juridical basis on the doctrine of frustration, yet the essential idea upon which the doctrine is based is that of impossibility of performance of the contract. In fact, impossibility and frustration are often used as interchangeable expressions. The changed circumstances, it is said, make the performance of the contract impossible, and parties are absolved from further performance of it as they did not promise to perform an impossibility. The Supreme Court also observed that in deciding cases in India, the only doctrine to go by is the supervening impossibility or illegality as laid down in Section 56 of the Act, taking the word impossible in its practical sense and not in its literal sense. Section 56 lays down a rule of positive law and does not leave the matter to be determined according to the intention of the parties. In a large number of cases, the doctrine of frustration is applied not on the ground that the parties have agreed to an implied term operated to release them from the performance of the contract. The relief is really given by the court itself on the ground of subsequent impossibility when it finds that the whole purpose or the basis of the contract is frustrated. I am emphasizing whole purpose or basis because I want to say something about this in the present context. Coming further to this, let us also have a look at the judgment of Nehati Jute Mills versus Khyaliram Jagannath, which is AIR 1968, Supreme Court 588. AIR 1968, Supreme Court 588, where the judgment of Satyabrata Ghosh has been followed, and the Supreme Court says that a contract is not frustrated merely because the circumstances in which it was made are altered. The courts have no general power to absolve a party from the performance of its part of the contract merely because its performance has now become onerous on account of an unforeseen turn of events. This judgment perhaps will have some implication on the present facts and circumstances that we are in the present times that we are going through. I kept emphasizing on frustration of the purpose or fundamental basis of the contract. In my assessment, this is the most important factor in a force majeure case. From the English judgments as well as the Indian judgments, the doctrine of frustration is based on the frustration of the purpose or basis of the contract. My assessment is based on two English cases and one Indian case. The first English case is the case of Sakira Glau versus Noble Thal GmbH. This is a tongue twister, but please take down the citation. It is 1961 to All England Reporter 179. We can refer to this, or it is rather popularly referred to as the Suez Canal case. The House of Lords was examining a contract for transport of groundnuts from Hamburg in Europe to the port of Sudan. The question was whether this contract was frustrated due to the closure of the Suez Canal. The House of Lords held that despite the closure of the Suez Canal and despite the fact that the customary route from Hamburg to the port of Sudan was through the Suez Canal, the contract was not frustrated. The contract crew would have to be performed by an alternative mode of performance, which was perhaps much more expensive as the ship would have to go all around Africa and around the Cape of Good Hope, which was 3 times the distance from Hamburg to Port of Sudan. The freight for such journey would also be considerably more, but still the House of Lords says that the contract would become onerous to perform, but it would not be fundamentally altered. Where the performance is otherwise possible, it is clear that mere rise in the freight price would not allow one of the parties to say that the contract was discharged by impossibility of performance. So here you see the House of Lords saying that the fundamental basis of the contract is not affected. You can still perform the contract, albeit that it will cost you more. Another case, which is an interesting case and more recent, it's a 2007 case, again of the English Court of Appeals, is the Sea Angel case. It enunciates the modern approach of the English courts to the doctrine of frustration. Sea Angel was a vessel which was used to assist in the salvage operations concerning the Tasman Spirit. Tasman Spirit was the name of a tanker which was loaded with light crude oil, which in July 2003 was grounded near the approaches of the Karachi port in Pakistan. In August 2003, the Tasman Spirit broke into two and resulted in a major pollution incident just off the coast of Karachi. In July 2003, Salvaris entered into a contract with the owners of Tasman Spirit to salvage the casualty. The salvage contract contained a compensation, protection, and indemnity clause. To fulfill their obligation under the contract, Salvaris engaged a number of subcontracted craft, including the Sea Angel, whose task was to act as a shuttle tanker, lightening Tasman Spirit and carrying oil from her to a larger tanker. Sea Angel was delivered in August 26, 2003, and it was to be returned by September 2003 at the port of Fujairah, which is one of the emirates in the United Arab Emirates. It was impossible to return Sea Angel because the authorities in Karachi refused to issue it a certificate showing that it did not owe any port fees for months. In the end, Sea Angel was returned in January 2004, but Salvaris did not pay any higher fees for the Sea Angel between September 2003 and January 2004. The claimants took legal action to recover the higher fees, and the Queen's Bench ruled in favor of the claimants. Salvaris therefore appealed before the Court of Appeals, and the main issue which came up before the Court of Appeals, there was a frustration of the contract by detention of Sea Angel in Karachi. Now, while deciding this issue, the Court of Appeals held, and I am quoting them, the application of the doctrine of frustration requires a multifactorial approach. Among the factors which have to be considered are the terms of the contract itself, its matrix or context, the parties' knowledge, expectations, assumptions, and contemplations, in particular as to the risk, as at the time of the contract, at any rate, so far as there can be ascribed mutually and objectively, and then the nature of the supervening event and the parties' future performance in the new circumstances. Since the subject matter of the doctrine of frustration is a contract, and contracts are about the allocation of the risk, and since the allocation and assumption of the risk is not simply a matter of express or implied provision, but may also depend on less easily defined matters such as the contemplation of the parties, the application can often be a difficult one. And the next part is important, please laying some emphasis on this. In such circumstances, the test of radically different is important. It tells us that the doctrine is not to be lightly invoked and that mere incidence of expense or delay or onerousness is not sufficient. In the context of these judgments, let us now take a jump by 10 years and come to the 2017 judgment of the Supreme Court in Energy Watchdog versus Central Electricity Regulatory Commission and others, which is Energy Watchdog versus CERC. It is 2017, volume 14, Supreme Court cases 80. This is a judgment authored by Justice Rohinton Fali Nariman in his inimitable style. This was a case relating to power purchase agreements. The Gujarat Urja Vikas Nigam had issued notice inviting proposals for supply of power. One of the bidders was Adani Enterprises. Now, Adani Enterprises had submitted the bid on the basis of the coal prices in Indonesia, which was considerably cheaper than the rest of the world. In 2010, there was a change in law in Indonesia, and the price of coal from Indonesia came up to the international standards. This being the case, Adani contended that on the ground of impact of Indonesian regulation, they should either be discharged from performance of the power purchase agreement on account of frustration, or there should be an evolution of a mechanism to restore them to the same economic condition which existed prior to the change in law. Justice Nariman makes a reference to all these judgments that I discussed and some more. And he observes, and I'm quoting paragraph 42 of the Supreme Court cases citation, I quote, "It is clear from the above that the doctrine of frustration cannot apply to these cases as the fundamental basis of the power purchase agreements remains unaltered. Nowhere do the PPAs state that coal is to be procured only from Indonesia at a particular price. In fact, it is clear on a reading of the PPA as a whole that the price payable for supply of coal is entirely for the person who sets up the power plant to bear. The fact that the fuel supply agreement is appended to the PPA is only to indicate that the raw material for the working of the plant is there and is in order." So therefore, again, Justice Nariman says that the fundamental basis is not affected, because nowhere does the agreement say that you must purchase the coal only from Indonesia or you must purchase it only at a particular price. Now let me come to the more interesting part of this talk. Let me talk about force majeure and the doctrine of frustration in the present times. A pneumonia of an unknown cause was detected in Wuhan, China, and was first reported to the country office of the WHO in China in December 2019. Within a month thereafter, that is on January 30, 2020, the outbreak was declared as a public health emergency of international concern by the World Health Organization. On February 11, 2020, the World Health Organization announced the name of the coronavirus disease, which is COVID-19. On March 24, 2020, the Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, ordered a nationwide lockdown as a preventive measure against the pandemic. At the time of the lockdown, the approximate number of confirmed COVID-19 cases was 500. Amongst other things, the lockdown led to severe restriction on people's movement, closure of commercial and private establishments, suspension of educational institutions, suspension of non-essential services, and prohibition of all non-essential activities. The WHO has praised the Indian effort as timely, comprehensive, and robust. The government has been responding to the COVID-19 pandemic as well in the commercial context. The Ministry of Finance, by their office memorandum on 19 February, referred to para 9.7.7 of the Manual for Procurement of Goods in 2017, which relates to force majeure. The para describes force majeure to mean, and I quote, "extraordinary events or circumstances beyond human control, such as an event described as an act of God, like a natural calamity, or events such as war, strike, riots, and crimes." Quote complete. The office memorandum clarified that the force majeure clause would not excuse a party's non-performance entirely, but would suspend it only for the duration of the force majeure. The OM further clarifies that the disruption of supply chains due to the spread of coronavirus in China or any other country should be considered as a natural calamity, and the force majeure clause may be invoked subject to the procedure which is prescribed. On the issues which largely affect individual citizens, the central government issued an order under the Disaster Management Act inter alia stopping landlords from demanding rent from the poor for 1 month. It provided that wherever workers, including migrants, are living in rented accommodation, the landlords of those properties shall not demand payment of rent for a period of 1 month. Similar orders were also passed by different state governments under different statutes. The government of Maharashtra instructed all landlords and house owners in the state to postpone rent collection by at least 3 months and help those whose income has been affected due to COVID lockdown. A notice to this effect was issued by the Maharashtra State Housing Department. Commercial transactions between parties relating to goods and services have also been affected in these circumstances. A question therefore arises is whether the parties to the contracts can be excused from performance of such contracts due to the restrictions, and can the restrictions or the pandemic be treated as a force majeure event across the board. In my assessment, which is based on the judgments that we have discussed, whether or not a contract would be frustrated by the present circumstances, irrespective of whether or not it includes a force majeure clause, would entirely depend on the nature of commitments made under that contract. For instance, I'm just giving you an example. If the pandemic and consequent lockdown frustrate the very basis of the contract, then perhaps it would stand frustrated. Now, to give you an example, take a situation where a company has entered into an agreement with a hotel to conduct an event on its premises on a date which falls within the time when the lockdown was declared. Pursuant to the lockdown, the event space would not be available for the designated purpose on the specified date and time. So therefore, you must note that the basis of the contract was the availability of the event space on the particular date. So if it is not available on the set date, then the basis would be materially affected. On the other hand, there may be numerous agreements which may be affected in the present situation, but would certainly not be frustrated because of the present situation. Again, to give you an example, an agreement to purchase a motor vehicle may not be, and maybe an example where the contract will continue to remain valid despite the present pandemic. The reason, in my opinion, being that the basis of the agreement is the existence of the motor vehicle and not the delivery date. I also wish to express an opinion which may perhaps not be very popular, but I believe is the correct view in law. There has been tremendous debate about tenancy agreements and leave and license agreements in the present context. Whether or not the rent is to be collected would, in my opinion, depend entirely on the sensitivity of your landlord. The pandemic has affected incomes of people across socio-economic stratas. Many have demanded that rent collection be suspended during these difficult times on the ground of force majeure. I reiterate that force majeure or the doctrine of frustration comes into play only in a situation where the basis of the agreement is extinguished. In my opinion, the basis of a rent agreement is the existence and access to the rented premises or the licensed premises, and not the income or ability of the tenant or the licensee to pay the rent. Therefore, leave and license and rent agreements would not stand frustrated merely because economic activity has otherwise been suspended. I say this in the context of laws relating to property, and at this stage I am refraining to comment upon the authority of the central and the state government to pass any directions under special statutes. In conclusion, I wish to reiterate that the concept of force majeure in the present circumstances and its applicability to different cases would depend entirely upon the facts and circumstances of each and every case. Neither can we lay down any formula, nor can we estimate the approach of the court when these kind of matters come up before it. One thing that I am reasonably certain of is that this situation in the future will add to the jurisprudence relating to the doctrine of frustration and force majeure, as that with these cases will at some point find their way to courts. With this, I want to conclude my lecture. I would like to thank the entire team of Adhivakta Parishad for giving me this opportunity to deliver this lecture on their platform and to assist all of you in understanding the concepts of frustration and force majeure in the present context. As a senior who I discussed this topic with indicated, Uh, this topic cannot be commented upon or discussed in the span of 40 to 45 minutes. We have really only scratched the surface of this jurisprudence, but perhaps well begun is half done, and I hope I have helped you begin well. I lastly want to take this opportunity to remind all of you to stay safe, protect yourself from the disease, and assist the authorities who are fighting this disease on our behalf. Donate whatever you can in terms of finances or your time, and enable the government to help fight this disease to make sure that our nation survives these hard times. Thank you very much.